Food can trigger such a huge spectrum of emotions, from positive to controlling and incredibly negative, and can ultimately lead to damage of physical as well as psychological health. Eating disorders are a complex mental health illness, and so many men and women are living with distorted perceptions of their body image and around the consumption of food. On this episode, I am pleased to be joined by an expert in this area, consultant dietitian Maeve Hanan, who has a range of experience in clinical nutrition and nutrition communication. She is passionate about communicating evidence-based nutrition messages which promote overall health, including a healthy relationship with food. Maeve is the founder of Dietetically Speaking, which promotes evidence-based nutrition messages online and on social media. She currently works with private clients, companies, and brands in the media. She's also an author and recently released her first book, Your No-Nonsense Guide to Eating Well, which is available on Amazon and in a variety of ebook formats. Please note this is an emotive subject that could be triggering to some people, so we'd advise listening to this episode in a safe space with support available. And if you are affected by any of today's episode and feel you need some support, the link to Beat, an eating disorder charity, can be found in the description below. So Maeve, welcome, and thank you so much for coming on the podcast today. I'm really excited to have you on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on. I'm delighted to be here.
So I'm just interested, you obviously have your history in dietetics, and I just wonder what kind of got you interested, I suppose, in kind of disordered eating and relationships with food?
Yeah, so it's something that when I was first deciding like what career route would I go down, I was really drawn to psychology and also nutrition. Decided to go down the nutrition route, which I absolutely love. But as I've been gaining more experience and working with different clients, it's something that really comes up again and again is a negative relationship with food and just the whole psychological aspect of eating, because it's so closely linked. And it's something that I've just always been really interested in. I found it really rewarding to work with people in that area. And, you know, there's such a high proportion of people that have had some sort of issue with a disordered relationship with food. You know, luckily for most people, that's not a clinical eating disorder. But, you know, on that sort of spectrum of the relationship with food, you know, a lot of us have at some stage, you know, maybe been in a more negative place with that, or maybe seen food in a little bit more of a kind of black and white way. And it's kind of when I got into blogging and being on social media and debunking fad diets and that kind of thing, it was almost like the next logical step was the kind of the myths that we get around food being so good and bad or black and white, and all these just really unhelpful messages that we get about nutrition. So that's really where my interest stems from.
Yeah, really interesting that you mentioned social media there, because it's definitely been an influence, hasn't it? And I think when we think about kind of relationships with food and those kind of maybe slightly more unhealthy angles, the media has undoubtedly played a massive role in the perception we have. And I loved you did a amazing post on fad diets and your like formula for fad diets. Would you mind just explaining that? Because I thought it just summarized it amazingly, because fad diets are everywhere, aren't they?
Yeah, they are. Absolutely. Thank you. So basically, yeah, I have a YouTube video that goes through this. And it's basically a lot of the key elements of a fad diet that you see, and I sort of put it together into a formula, and I hope I can remember it now. But it's basically you take like an exaggerated claim and then you minus the evidence and you multiply it by celebrity endorsement. And basically what you're left with is just absolute nonsense. Because, you know, they were some of the key elements I was seeing, that they're not evidence-based. You know, there's big names or the celebrities behind some of these diets, and, you know, a lot of people are drawn to that. And also just the unrealistic claims. You know, most of us will be drawn to, oh, this food is going to, you know, make you live longer, make you more beautiful, you know, all these things. So you can totally see why people are drawn to that, but it's really, it's, you know, it's smoke and mirrors. It's just not a sustainable approach. And really a lot of those faddy diets aren't just a waste of time and money, but they can be harmful, especially in the long run.
Yeah, that's a really good point, isn't it? That actually they can be damages to health. And that's what makes it such an irresponsible thing, I suppose, when these are kind of protruded all over social media.
Yeah.
So I know we kind of discussed in terms of disordered eating and relationships with food, there is that massive spectrum, and people probably commonly hear of eating disorders and some of the disorders they might be more common with. But could you just kind of describe that spectrum and actually how widespread that could be?
Absolutely. So some of the main categories of eating disorders that we have, so these would be specifically defined in the DSM manual. But basically, it would range from things like anorexia nervosa. So that's a really restrictive type eating disorder. And there's a lot of kind of common traits between different types of eating disorders, but anorexia would be really characterized by being very restrictive, often a low body weight, not always, body dysmorphia. And it's actually the mental health illness that has the highest risk of death. So really serious, can be really extreme. And that's where, if you see people who are, really malnourished and really unwell with their eating disorder, that will be a common feature of anorexia on the severe end of the scale in terms of anorexia. Then we have bulimia nervosa, and that is characterized by purging. So it is the different forms of purging. So it could be vomiting, it can be use of laxatives, it can be over exercise. So it's basically these unhealthy compensatory behaviors to basically get rid of food, kind of use up calories. So laxatives would be another form of purging. We have binge eating disorder. So that is where somebody eats an unusually large amount of food, usually in a short period of time, and it's usually quite uncontrolled. And that there's basically this cycle of binging that can happen, where it can be related to restriction and feelings of guilt and shame around food, which can then feed back into that cycle. You then can get ARFID, so that is a more newly defined type of eating disorder, and it's avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. And it's where somebody eats just a very small range of foods, and it's associated with autism in some cases, or it's where there's just quite strong food fears, and it's not actually driven by body image issues. It's more of kind of a fear of the food itself. And then you have this category of the unspecified type eating disorders. And actually about, more than 50% of eating disorders would fall into that category, because most people don't just kind of slot nicely into a specific diagnosis. So it might be that somebody has most of the characteristics of binge eating disorder, but doesn't quite meet like the frequency of how often you'd be binging to meet that diagnosis. Or there could be overlap where somebody basically has like elements of different types of the eating disorders. And then so that's kind of the clinical eating disorders themselves. And then for each one of those, really, there is its own spectrum in terms of how severe, or it could be subclinical. So maybe subclinical binge eating disorder, as I said, where somebody has some of the characteristics but doesn't binge, say, once a week, or maybe they used to, and as part of their recovery, it's becoming less frequent. So we have that kind of the clinical eating disorder, we have the subclinical, and then we have the kind of disordered, kind of unhealthy relationship with food. And then we have, I'm not really sure what the best term is for it, because, normal, everyone's normal is slightly different. It's not just one thing, but I guess it's a more kind of freer, flexible relationship with food. So that would be how I would describe that sort of spectrum.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And it's really interesting because some of the things that you were discussing there, especially the kind of links with autism, that makes perfect sense. And I've never heard of that before. So thank you for clarifying. That's amazing. And so when we think about, I guess, we've got kind of the eating disorders that are maybe slightly more categorized, and then just this general relationship with food that sometimes can be detrimental and playing into things like fad diets and the obsession with body image and body dysmorphia. I'm assuming that that's kind of something that could be really underreported because of the kind of mainstreamness of it, if you like. Is that what you kind of find in your practice?
Yeah, definitely. And I guess even when we look at the statistics themselves, they're really based on the clinical eating disorders. So about 1.25 million people in the UK having an eating disorder, but we don't have such specific numbers in terms of disordered eating or an unhealthy relationship with food. But we do see that even like the clinical eating disorders themselves are becoming more common in terms of about there's been about a third of an increase in diagnosis, and that might be related to improved diagnosis. But also, we do see that sort of rise in those statistics. Yeah, but absolutely, there's quite a few people that either kind of fall through the net, even if they have asked for support. But with these kind of illnesses, it's quite common for people not to seek support, to feel quite guilty or shameful, or to almost feel like it's normal, how normalized it is in our society to feel like you have to constantly be on a diet, or how negatively so many people talk about their bodies and other people's bodies. So for some people, especially if it's on the less extreme end of the scale, they may not feel like there's actually much of an issue there. But if it's having a negative impact on your life, if it's overwhelming, if it's taking over like mental head space from other parts of your life, then it really is a problem. And I really encourage people to seek support.
Yeah, that's really important. And it's scary, isn't it, to think how normal, like you say, it's become. Like, to hear someone's on a diet, you don't even think twice, do you, nowadays? Like, that just seems to be everywhere, diets and try this and try that. And you do such an amazing job through your social media and through your blogging in kind of dispelling myths about food, because the media really has done us a huge injustice over the years, hasn't it? And we're kind of, I guess, only really scratching the tip of the iceberg and trying to start dispelling some of these things. And I wonder whether you could just kind of, I suppose, allude to some of these massive myths. So I don't think there's been a food group really that's not been caught up in it, has there, in terms of macronutrients and even individual foods like eggs and red meat. So I just wonder if you could dispel some of the myths, maybe around the aspect of fats in our diet, because I know that's a massive one that has caused huge amount of confusion.
Yes, good question. Yeah, you're so right. It's a full-time job, basically trying to keep up with all the myths and the fads that are out
Yeah.
there about food, and media, social media. There's just so many confusing messages. So you're asking specifically about fats and the role that they play in our diet?
Yeah, I just wonder, because I know that's something that people are maybe slightly anxious about including in their diet, and the media has just caused this explosion of confusion that I think probably a lot of people don't really know what the right thing, if you like, is to do around it, consuming them.
Yes. No, absolutely. Because you're right. There was a lot of stigmatization of fats, especially kind of around the 80s when all these low fat diets were becoming quite popular and were actually, promoted by some governments and things as well. And we do have more evidence coming through, more specifically about different types of fats and the role that they play on our health. But in general, we absolutely need fats. Fats do play an important role in our body. We need fats to absorb certain vitamins, like our fat soluble vitamins, vitamin A, D, E, and K. And within our body, fats play an important role in hormone production, in insulation of our body, in terms of, heart health and brain health and everything. And that's where we kind of come to the specific types of fats. So particularly in terms of brain health and heart health, our omega-3s are really important. And that's the type of fat that we mainly get from oily fish. We get a precursor form in some plant-based foods, so like in flax seeds and rapeseed oil, that part of that can become converted into the active form of omega-3, but the type in oily fish is already active and ready to go. So that's a really beneficial one. And then our other types of, I guess what we would often call the kind of, healthy fats that just have a lot of evidence behind their health promoting impact would be like olive oil. So there's so much evidence that olive oil is really, really good for us. It's, full of vitamins and antioxidants, polyphenols, and the fats in there are mainly unsaturated fats, and monounsaturated fats in particular. And so there's two ways of looking at food. You can sort of break it down into all those constituents, or you can look at the effect that the whole food has and look at the effect in terms of populations. And when we look at the effect of the whole food, it's more representative really, because we don't, break up our foods into individual nutrients and like have a plate of omega-3s. We would have like potatoes and veg and oily fish. So when we look at olive oil itself and the role that it's played in the Mediterranean diet in particular, it seems to have a really protective effect in terms of the risk of heart disease and stroke, and just play a really important role. So that's a really healthy one. And other ones would be like nuts and seeds and avocado and hummus. So they're ones that would be higher in those unsaturated fats that I mentioned. But other sources of fats would be things like butter, coconut oil, pastries, those kind of foods. And we can absolutely have those foods in our diet. We often get the message that we have to almost avoid sugar and saturated fat. And that's not the case at all. You know, a lot of people on a population level may benefit from having them in slightly smaller amounts, but it really depends on the individual, because a lot of the clients that I would work with who would have issues with disordered eating or actual eating disorders, then it may be the exact opposite for them. And they may actually need to work on reintroducing those foods if they've completely cut them out, because nothing needs to be off limits unless you're allergic to it. And as I said, fats themselves do play an important role in our body.
That's a really great point, actually. I love that you say that actually we shouldn't be cutting anything out, because that's where I think a lot of again, we allude to the media and kind of restrictive eating is cutting out major food groups. And I think that's probably something that a lot of the general population, even if they haven't got any kind of disordered eating that's been diagnosed, probably struggle with. And I think probably most women and men have experimented with these kind of fatty diets where they are cutting out or restricting major food groups. So that's a really good point, in that actually we should be able to openly consume everything, some things in different proportions to others, but actually having that freedom to enjoy all types of food. For sure.
Yeah, I think that is just such an important message. And especially because, as you're saying, it changes over the years, you know, which foods are stigmatized and things. But I guess at the moment, there's a lot of focus on plant-based eating. And although there's lots of benefits in terms of eating plants, a plant-based diet doesn't need to be plant only. And there's lots of benefits to animal-based foods, although we just need them in slightly smaller amounts than the plant-based foods. But, you know, when you are in an environment where people are, you know, sometimes shaming you for your food choice, then it can become really difficult. Or even when I work with teenagers and young people, and, you know, their friends are experimenting with, you know, going vegan and giving up foods. And at that age group, it can be a higher risk of developing an eating disorder, and just restricting foods, taking out food groups for some people can cause problems. So it just is important to bear in mind.
Yeah, definitely. And so when we talk about, I guess, cutting out food groups and restricting food, are there any kind of key signs and symptoms that we can look out for, either for individuals or people that you maybe are close with, in terms of detecting maybe some sort of issues with food that might be emerging?
Yeah, good question. So one would be, so what's the level of restriction? So is it that they are, you know, trying to eat slightly smaller portions, or, you know, trying to experiment with having like fruit for dessert sometimes instead of chocolate? You know, if they're doing it in quite like a moderation way, but it's not off limits, then that would be kind of a healthier approach. If it seems to be very black and white, like I can never eat this food, or they seem quite, you know, maybe anxious and stressed even at the thought of it, or in social situations, if it, you know, if it becomes really difficult to find somewhere to eat out and that kind of thing, that can be a sign. Another thing to think about is what's the motivation behind it. So I guess I was talking about plant-based diets there. So if it is, say somebody's gone vegan and their motivation seems to be mainly around food, and they're talking about food and like saying that there's less calories in these plant-based foods and that kind of thing, then that will be more of an alarm bell, rather than if it was to be motivated by animal welfare or the environment. Because, well, partly because it's, from a nutrition point of view, you don't need to cut out any foods, as I was saying. And if nutrition is the main motivator, then it can just be a way of restricting calories, basically. And that's where, you know, you need to be a little bit more cautious. So they'd be some of the things to think about. So kind of what's the reason behind it, and kind of how extreme is it, and is it interfering with social interactions? Is it kind of causing isolation?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I suppose that kind of, in that food becomes a focus of everything and is kind of all consuming, is where it can, I suppose, start to become slightly dangerous for individuals.
Mm-hmm.
And then when we think, I guess, about the general population, are there any people who are perhaps maybe more at risk of developing some disordered eating or a diagnosed eating disorder over others?
Yeah, there are. So as I mentioned, teenagers and young people are often at a higher risk, partially related to the, you know, the pressures and all the media and social media messages that we discussed. And also, you know, parts of their brain just aren't fully formed in terms of, you know, logic and making rational decisions. So they can be at a higher risk. It's interesting because we're still finding out some of the causes and the reasons behind eating disorders. But we know that it's a combination really of biological factors and environmental factors. So, partially genetics, and then also environmental factors, like, is there somebody else that in the house that's been dieting and, that's been kind of a triggering event for somebody, or all these images in the media or on social media, or an episode of trauma, for example. These types of things in somebody who's already kind of genetically predisposed, that combination of the two seems to increase the risk of an eating disorder. So other things to think about is, if it's in the family, then it can sometimes be more likely, and kind of for a combination of genetic and environmental reasons, because if it's again in the family, somebody may have just kind of grown up seeing that or been exposed to it, or again, it could just be in the genes. So it's not to say that it's anybody's fault. It's not, it's quite a complex picture in terms of what the causes are. Mental health issues as well are quite closely linked. So issues with depression, anxiety, alcohol, drug abuse, being very preoccupied in terms of body image, so body image issues. People who are also have more perfectionist tendencies and quite kind of high achievers, because that can go down the kind of the rigid thinking, less flexible sort of route, which can then be translated into food. And as I said, trauma itself are just quite triggering events, and those events can be really different for different people. But sometimes it's cases of physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. It can be a bereavement. It can be being bullied. It can be being under like a lot of pressure. Or for some people, times like significant times in their life, like somebody trying to lose weight for a wedding, or some people find actually, even if they've been recovered, that during pregnancy can be quite a triggering time as well, or even postpartum, so after having the baby. So it's there's quite a few different things that can impact it, and as I said, it's generally that combination of genetic and some other kind of lifestyle factors.
It's such a complex picture, isn't it? It's so I guess so individual as well to each person.
Yeah,
Sure.
absolutely.
So when we talk about sort of, I guess, younger people being slightly more at increased risk of developing disordered eating habits, and that kind of environmental influence, especially in the home environment, is there kind of any things we can do in our family homes to try and reduce the risk of kind of unhealthy relationships with food and eating?
Yeah, really good question. And I should say as well that even though these are some of the people that are more likely to be at risk, an eating disorder can impact anyone of any age, of any race. So we often, I think I did mention myself, young women, it's not to say that nobody else can develop an eating disorder, and we are seeing higher rates in men in particular and in boys. So in terms of the home environment, it's really important just to try and normalize eating as much as possible, and keeping it as a positive time. So basically, not talking about calories, not talking about diets, cutting out foods, not kind of shaming anyone for what they're eating or commenting on what they're eating too much. And the same goes for body image. So not talking about your own body or other people's body in a negative way. And it's that modeling behavior. So the parents are modeling the behavior of, eating all different kinds of foods. So, not banning any foods from the house or anything like that, or not putting any foods on a pedestal either. So trying to be quite neutral with language. So just call food by the name of that food. So not calling it a treat or naughty or a cheat day or any of that stuff. We just want to call it like a biscuit or a packet of crisps or whatever it is. And if that's the home environment, then it can just be a lot less triggering and a more helpful situation.
Yeah, that's a great tip actually, because they're some of the words that you use there we hear all the time, don't we? And absolutely, I've said them myself, this is a treat, or
Mm-hmm.
I've been a bit naughty because I've eaten this chocolate, and we really need to try and disconnect those kind of emotive words, don't we, with food?
It's true, and it's hard. I feel like treat in particular is a really hard one to break. If you've been, brought up using that word, I have to stop myself all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. And even when we speak about like our animals, you know, we give them food as a treat. It kind of
Uh-huh.
radiates all through our lives, doesn't it? For sure. But our
Absolutely.
language of food is so important, as you say, and that having that variety. And we spoke about a little bit about calorie counting, which I think is another massive issue. And I think probably most people, if they haven't calorie counted to some extent themselves, will know people that are rigidly calorie counting for whatever particular reason. And I wonder whether maybe for some individuals having, I guess, more of an awareness of calories without necessarily doing rigid maths and adding it up and knowing exactly the ins and outs, is that necessarily such a bad thing to some extent?
Yeah, so when it comes to nutrition, like there really aren't any black and whites where this is always good and this is always bad, unless obviously you're allergic to something or it's poisonous. But otherwise, you know, there are some people that are able to calorie count or have that calorie awareness, and it's absolutely fine for them, or it's even helpful for them. Um, but on a kind of a larger scale, so it's quite relevant at the moment because with the new obesity strategy, you know, this talk of putting calories on all menus and, you know, being very visible in lots of places. I would argue that's not the best approach. I think it's good to have the information available for people who want to go and look for it. But we do also have these vulnerable people to think about. That means that, you know, it's going to make just going to a restaurant or something that was already going to be a really triggering event even more difficult. Um, but yeah, I mean, there is a more kind of a moderation approach, as you're saying. So I mean, for some people, though, any type of calorie counting, focusing on numbers is going to be triggering and you really need to step away from it. So if anybody has a history of an eating disorder or feels like they may be predisposed to that, then you're really best to stay away from the numbers, really try and disconnect from calorie counting because it's not even that accurate. So two people could eat the same amount of calories and they would actually digest different amounts depending on their hormones, depending on what's going on with them that day. And also, I mean, the estimates on the packet, you know, they are estimates. And the same with if you calculate your calorie requirements, or, you know, if I calculate calorie requirements for a client, it's always an estimate. It's never like an exact science unless you're doing specific tests in a lab. You know, that's the only way you're going to get a more accurate estimation of calorie requirements. So yeah, so it's really variable. So that's what I always say is you should always take it with a pinch of salt. And with anything, you need to have some flexibility from it. So if it becomes a thing that calorie counting is something that you need to do every day, you feel really worried if you don't do it, it means it's kind of going back to we're saying, you know, interfering with socializing and that kind of thing. If it's like, oh, you know, I don't know, if you went on holidays or something back in the day when we used to go on holidays,
Yeah.
you know, if you couldn't get the app to work in that country or something, like it'd be really stressful, it'd be really difficult. If you're getting those kind of signs, then it's okay, this may be unhealthy, this may be a bit obsessive. And some people use it just to begin with to get an idea of the calories in food or an idea of what they need, but then gradually move away from that and try and become a little bit more intuitive or a little bit more flexible with it. So yeah, so for some people it can be okay. But for anyone who is predisposed to disordered eating, definitely not.
Yeah, that's really great advice actually, because there's apps everywhere, isn't there, about kind of calorie counting and having
Yeah.
that awareness that actually is this going to become something that becomes actually quite obsessive and unhealthy, and reduces your flexibility, then we need to be just curbing that straight away.
Definitely. And I
Definitely.
mean, there's such a fine line between kind of healthy and obsessive because, you know, you start off just being kind of conscientious and thinking, okay, I'm just going to eat well and I'm going to, you know, do some activity and blah, blah, blah. And then that can just start to spiral in some cases into being really, really restrictive or really inflexible. And that's in terms of disordered eating, where we are talking more kind of the orthorexia side of things. So that obsession with healthy eating, which isn't yet kind of an official eating disorder, but it's something that I think is very common, especially in the age of social media.
And yeah, and when you talk about orthorexia, actually, that's a really great point. I wonder, we had this, I guess, a few years ago, this massive explosion of the clean eating, didn't we? Kind of everywhere, everything was clean eating. And do you think that's kind of played into this perfectionism and avoidance of anything that isn't totally, you know, green or organic or completely nutritious?
Yeah, definitely. Because even that language, I mean, that's so toxic talking about food as being clean because then it's insinuating that other food is unclean or bad. And it's totally that black and white thing. And it was quite clean eating. I found a really insidious one, because on the face of it, it didn't seem that bad. It was like, oh, I'm just eating well. But actually, when you looked at clean eating, it was restrictive. It was talking about avoiding gluten for no reason, avoiding dairy, and a lot of focus on organic food, and a lot of things that just aren't necessary for a healthy diet. And then again, that kind of that black and white restriction. And for some people, it kind of became, I'm eating clean this day, and then again, this is a cheat day, and this is, words that are, around still, and they're still very common for people to talk about eating clean and clean eating, even though thankfully the fad itself is kind of over.
Yeah, definitely. And I've 100% used those terms in the past in a what I consider to be a balanced way, I suppose. But I definitely got sucked up in having those clean eating books, or it's cheat day, so we're going to have a takeaway. Like, I've definitely used that terminology without even thinking about how that could be damaging to the people around me, or our own image. And I think, yeah, it's great that we're starting to raise awareness and move away from these terms of good food and bad food, and recognize that all food is nutritious in some way, but that, and the kind of components of that could vary.
Absolutely. And that's where, like, if we look at some of the main principles of eating well, this is something I talk about in my book, is that variety is so key. And when we eat a variety of foods, we get lots of different nutrients, but it also means that we have that flexibility. So if nothing's off limits, again, unless you decide, for ethical reasons, or if you have a certain allergy, there are definitely caveats to it. But for the most part, if nothing's off limits to you, and you then approach it from a place of self-care, and it's more, okay, how am I going to feel good, what's going to nourish my body, but what's also just going to taste good, and what am I going to enjoy, because that's still an important part.
Definitely, food can be such an amazing part of life, can't it? And that's, I guess, where it's
Yes.
so sad and damaging when that becomes a compulsive or a restrictive or a really negative emotion that's associated with foods, rather than those kind of positive and enjoyments.
Absolutely. And that's why I really do enjoy working with people when they start to get that food freedom back. And even if it's just, a tiny baby step in the right direction, that the fact that people can actually, enjoy a meal with their family or their friends again, or, just enjoy the taste of a food that they haven't eaten in a long time. I really enjoy that.
That must be such a rewarding moment. And actually, for
Mhm.
anyone who's listening who perhaps is going through an eating disorder journey, to hear that that is hopefully their future reality,
Yeah.
must feel like a mile away, but actually is really possible with the support and help and guidance that they need.
That's it. And it's looking at the kind of the bigger picture of, where have you come from, and, those baby steps as well, because it can seem so overwhelming if somebody's very unwell and they're in a very restrictive place. But if you can gradually start to, work through some reintroductions and, get help with your nutrition plan, it can just make such a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder, we've kind of talked about the food element of disordered eating and relationships with food, but I wonder
Mhm.
whether physical activity and exercise, where does that kind of fit in?
Yeah, so it really depends on the individual and the type of eating disorder or disordered eating that they're going through. If somebody has a severe eating disorder, and for example, if they're admitted into hospital, then they may be on bed rest. So exercise may be off the table altogether. Similarly, if somebody is recovering, but they're at home, but they're getting, they're seeing a dietitian and a psychologist and keeping in touch with their doctor, it may be that they still need to limit their activity. So it depends how they're doing in terms of, how are their blood results, and if it's for women, have they got their period back regularly, and how's their energy levels, and how are they doing with their nutrition plan, and that kind of thing, before they can start to increase their activity levels again. For other people, focusing on, so say, I guess if we're talking about the more, so not a clinical eating disorder, but if somebody has more of a disordered relationship with food, and possibly that might be impacting exercise as well. So if exercise has become kind of an obsessive thing, or a punishment, or something that you avoid because you hate, because you really force yourself to do, really strenuous exercise that you just don't enjoy, then coming at that from a place of self-care as well can be really helpful. So focusing on gentle movement, and intuitive movement, so movement that you enjoy basically. So for some people, it's like starting off with gentle yoga or some walks, and maybe it's a walk with your partner or your friends. Just something that you enjoy, really. That's the key part of it. And generally trying to just think, okay, well, what would actually feel good today, rather than what do I feel like I should do? So rather than, okay, because if you've been in a cycle of I need to do this to burn calories or to get a beach bod, or, any of these, more harmful approaches, then it can be a totally different mindset just to think, okay, how does my body feel today? Do I need rest? Maybe I don't need any exercise today. Or would some gentle yoga or a walk feel good? And then, maybe start to build it up a little bit to find other activities that are maybe a little bit more active. But again, it will depend on the stage of recovery.
I love that you mentioned that actually what's going to feel good today, rather than what's my mind telling me that I've got to do, because that's definitely for some people going to be a really overwhelming emotion. So changing your mindset on that's really important. And that beach bod, oh my goodness, what an awful media campaign this has been for years and years and years, hasn't it? And I guess that falls in line with that getting your post-baby body back, which as a midwife makes me so furious. And these are the kind of things that have just caused so much damage to so many people, haven't they?
Absolutely. And yeah, that's a really good point to mention that. And there's so much pressure on new mothers as it is. And to have, all these negative media images then about like, here's this person's body, soon after giving birth and everything. And it's just, it's so toxic. I mean, it's amazing what our bodies can do and how our bodies can change. And just this, promoting this image that we're supposed to stay and like look like a teenager or an unrealistic model forever. It's just really toxic.
It really is, isn't it? And I think for anyone who's experiencing, I guess, maybe some negative comparison or things on social media, it's just so important that they unfollow those people and actually fill their feed with positive and realistic and healthy expectations, rather than these extreme kind of takes on various fads and an image.
That's it. Or even move away from people altogether and just follow like puppies and bunnies and just things that make you happy.
Yeah, I love it. Definitely. So when we, I suppose, look at the range of eating disorders, do you find that generally people are able to recognize a problem themselves, or does it tend to come from maybe people around them? What's your experience?
It's been a bit of both in my experience, because I'm thinking mainly of with some of the younger people I've worked with, so more the kind of adolescent group. A lot of the time it has been from the parents, or sometimes from like a sports coach or something like that. But even with some of the adults I've worked with, yeah, it has been like partners and things have noticed, but a lot of the time the person themselves does have some sort of inkling. It's just they may not always be at the stage of being fully ready to ask for help and to acknowledge it. So yeah, it's been a bit of a mix of both, really, in my experience.
And I suppose that's where kind of raising the awareness around disordered eating and sort of breaking down that taboo is really important, isn't it? So that actually people can start these conversations and then actually access the help that they really, really need.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where the Beat website that you mentioned is so helpful. There's loads of great resources on there, and there's like specific leaflets about if you suspect somebody close to you has an eating disorder, how do you approach that? What do you do? And even some of the kind of the early signs and symptoms as well. So there's two different ones that are fairly easy to remember. So you have lips, flips, hips, kips, nips, and skips. So that's kind of one approach. And what it means is it's just kind of to remind you of some of the key aspects of disordered eating. So lips is that person being obsessive around what they're putting through their mouth. So are they obsessing about food? Flips is behavior changing. So it's behavior flipping back and forth. Hips, a distortion around body image. Kips, somebody often being tired or struggling with concentration. Nips is nipping to the toilet after meals, so possibly purging. And then skips is somebody starting to exercise regularly. So that's one image that they have up on the Beat website, which can be helpful in terms of signposting. And then another one is called the SCOFF questionnaire. And it's SCOFF, and it stands for sick, control, one, fat, and food. And what it means is, do you ever make yourself sick because you feel uncomfortably full? Do you ever worry that you've lost control over how much you eat? Have you recently lost more than 1 stone in a 3-month period? Do you believe yourself to be fat when other people say you're too thin? And would you say that food dominates your life? So that's another kind of brief overview in terms of some of the signs and symptoms if you suspect that somebody close to you may have issues with food, or if you yourself feel like there may be an issue there. I mean, really the one key question I would always bring it back to is, do you think that food dominates your life in an unhealthy way? And if the answer is yes, maybe unsure, then I would always encourage somebody to seek support, or at least to speak to a friend or a loved one.
Yeah, that's a really great advice. And those tools, I suppose, are things that we can almost do just to screen ourselves now and again, maybe when life's getting a bit chaotic, and just reassess where we're at and actually what do we need to be focusing on. Because I think the one we spoke about do you think you're fat when other people don't, I think is probably massively common when you think about the general population and all of the ad hoc diets that people might go on, and again alluding to those restriction in food groups. And actually looking at our bodies in a positive light, we seem to be absolutely terrible at, don't we? Like, we're just terrible. And sometimes I think we need to just stand in the mirror and say, do you know what, actually, my body's great because it's free of disease. It allows me to do whatever it is that makes you feel good, be that running or your job or having, you know, grown children or birth children, and looking at those positive things rather than, oh, I've got some cellulite on my thighs, like 99.9% of other women in the world. And I think that's where social media has really got to start taking responsibility in being real and empowering women, rather than making them feel so kind of critical and negative about their own bodies.
Yeah, 100%. And because, you know, it may not come naturally to everyone, as you're saying, to think about our body in such a positive way, it's almost like kind of like a muscle that you need to exercise, but it's exercising that kind of self-control and body acceptance, or even body positivity, if you can get to that stage. And it can be, as you're saying, literally looking in the mirror and just thinking, you know, why are you grateful for each part of your body? There's some nice like little meditations and things you can do about it. And just starting to reframe it, really, when that negative voice pops up, it's not to, you know, push it away or ignore it, but it's to, you know, how would you respond to a friend that was saying that about themselves, and try and be as kind and compassionate to yourself.
That's a great tip, isn't it? Because I'm sure the things that people say to themselves, they would never even dream of considering, let alone saying to somebody else. And we definitely need to give ourselves that self-love as well, for sure. Now, I just wonder whether the current climate and COVID-19 and lockdown and the kind of widespread anxiety that I think most people are experiencing anyway, has that kind of caused, I don't know, a peak or more issues with disordered eating?
Yeah, there have been a few studies actually investigating this. There was one that came out of Australia about a month or two ago. Um, and it kind of reflected what some of my clients were telling me around some of the difficulties that are arising during lockdown. And this is some people who already had disordered eating or an eating disorder, and then also people who were on the less extreme end of the spectrum to start with. So I think it's affected people in lots of different ways. Some of it being, you know, there's been quite a heavy emphasis on exercise and workout at home. And, you know, that hasn't been a normal thing for a lot of people to do. And it's become a lot more common. And not to say that that's bad or anything, but for somebody who has an eating disorder and may be prone to over exercise, if their whole house is suddenly, you know, doing lots of exercise very close to them or in the house, it can just make you feel kind of guilty, or feel that you should be doing that as well. When in a lot of cases, you know, they should be avoiding that type of exercise. Same with food, you know, there's been a lot of emphasis on, I guess, healthy eating and home cooking, and, you know, but a lot of it has been really positive in terms of, you know, making sourdough and baking and, you know, just enjoying getting in touch with food again. So there has been some positives, some negatives. And for some people, it's just increased anxiety in general. And that increase in anxiety can then play out in terms of the eating disorder, in terms of trying to regain control by restricting food intake, or by the eating disorder trying to regain a bit more control. So yeah, there's lots of ways that it has negatively impacted people's relationship with food, and in some cases the recovery journey. But also, you know, it has been a time of, you know, learning, and for some people it has actually just given them a little bit more time to kind of, you know, reflect and relax, and it has been helpful for some people. So I've seen kind of both ends of the spectrum.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I suppose when you feel like everything outside of your body is losing control, because obviously we've got no control about what's going on in the world and no sort of end point, I wonder whether maybe people are therefore focusing on that exercise and food to kind of replace the control that they might have had in their normal day. And I suppose it's raised some new challenges for people for sure.
Yeah.
So for people, Maeve, who have detected that perhaps them or somebody that's one of their loved ones may have some disordered eating with food, what do they do in terms of accessing help? I know we spoke about Beat, which is obviously an amazing charity, but what kind of avenues are there into accessing treatment and support?
So the first port of call is really speak to your GP, speak to your doctor, because the support services available do differ depending on different areas. And it's always just good to get that medical support and medical checkup, because if somebody has an eating disorder, it's that kind of 3-prong approach of medical support from a doctor, nutrition support from a dietitian, and psychological support. They're the 3 things that really help to improve and speed up recovery. So that first step is, speaking to your doctor about that, seeing what's available. You'll most likely get a blood test taken to check, some of those important factors. And then it will depend. So unfortunately, some of the waiting lists for actual eating disorder treatment in the NHS can be quite long, but it will of course depend on the area that you're in. But there's lots of, really great specialist teams in terms of community mental health teams and eating disorder teams, and specific to young people and to adults. There's also then, support available down the private route. So, I work with some clients privately online, and there's other dietitians and psychologists and therapists who also work privately. And there's some groups as well. So it again depends on the type of the eating disorder or disordered eating and the overall condition. But sometimes there are kind of like CBT groups and general support groups. And on the Beat website, they have some support services on there. So really the starting point, I usually encourage people to go to the doctor and to have a look on the Beat website.
Amazing. And I suppose sparking up those conversations is like lots of mental health issues, sometimes one of the most challenging hurdles, isn't it? And
yes,
and one of the bravest things actually is recognizing that and then accessing help. And so I would encourage, I suppose, for anyone who is approaching these conversations and having difficulty vocalizing it, is that it's absolutely fine to write your feelings down and present that to the GP, or take someone with you as a kind of advocate. And are they things that you see kind of happening in practice?
Yeah, that can be a really helpful thing to do. I guess when I'm working with somebody, they've often already been through that step. But yeah, it can definitely be really helpful. And the other thing is, people can be really nervous to talk to those close to them. Sometimes it's easier to speak to, almost like a random health professional rather than somebody who knows you really well. And sometimes it's the opposite way. Sometimes people are more comfortable speaking to those that are close to them and feel strange kind of speaking to kind of an outsider about this. So whatever you find, the easiest as a starting point, it just really is important to have that conversation. So whether it's friends and family, whether it's health professional, ideally both. And if you are really nervous about those first conversations, you don't always have to, go into loads of detail or anything. It doesn't need to be this massive conversation. It can just be, I'm struggling with my food, my body image, I'm working on it, I'm getting support. Just even setting the scene in that way, and just, taking it from there, because it'll start to take the power out of the eating disorder the more you can speak about it and get support and kind of bring it out into the light. Because if it's left kind of by itself, it gives it more space to thrive and to take over and to take more control. So it is just really important to have those conversations.
Yeah, brilliant. That's really great advice. And I guess in terms of treatment for eating disorders, it's going to vary depending on severity and type. But would you mind just kind of summarising some of the, I guess, most common options and kind of routes that people might be directed along?
Yeah, so as I said, it should really be the psychological support, the nutrition support, and the medical support. And then, as I said, it might be support from a community team that would have all of those aspects to support you. Or for some people, especially if they go down the private route, then you might find your own therapist, your own dietitian. And in terms of the therapy itself, so obviously, you know, I can't really speak about the psychological side of things in too much detail, but some of the approaches that, you know, I've heard about or read about, and my clients have told me about, have been around use of CBT, around acceptance therapy, around the self-guided help as well, self-guided therapy. So more where somebody is either in a group or an individual setting, kind of given kind of reflections and exercises to do, and the health professional, you know, just kind of guides the person through that. But it's a lot of self-directed work. And then there is a type of CBT specific to eating disorders as well. So they'd be some of those kind of approaches. From the nutrition side of things, it really does depend on the situation. So if somebody is a very restrictive eating disorder, or if it's anorexia, then it's often, you know, you'll have a nutrition plan to start with. Somebody has to build up their nutrition intake gradually. And then it's often working through the kind of food fears. So gradually reintroducing foods as well, expanding the dietary intake. For some people, if it's, say, more kind of binge eating disorder, then it's really important to establish regular eating. So eating every 2 to 3 hours, you know, having your 3 meals, your 3 snacks, and, you know, focusing on balancing the meals so they're also satisfying and will keep you going and are nutritious, of course. And also, yeah, it's kind of similar in terms of working through food fears, and also there's a lot of debunking and putting into perspective nutrition and the fads and things, because if somebody is struggling with their food and their relationship with food, and they have all these kind of misconceptions or all these ideas in their head, a lot of the time it's about like debunking that and kind of reassuring around food.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess that's really useful for people to understand that it is that multi-pronged approach, because you've got the psychological element, the physical element, and then obviously that recovery in terms of looking at nutrition and food and the way forward for everybody. And the debunking of myths, to anyone who is still got any illusions over kind of food restriction or kind of myths around food, I would absolutely recommend heading over to Maeve's page, which will be linked in the bio, because you do debunk them just so brilliantly.
Oh, thank you.
And hopefully people will start to understand that actually all food is food, and that we shouldn't be restricting any kind of food groups, and we need to be working through that if that's kind of a headspace, I suppose, that people might be in.
Yes,
definitely. Amazing. And so I suppose for people who maybe have not got a specified eating disorder, but have got this general, maybe slightly unhelpful relationship with food or with their body image, would you be able to give us a few little top tips for managing that and trying to work through that and make food more of a positive thing for them?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing is really, as we were saying, taking food off that pedestal. So realizing that there's no such thing as good and bad foods. It's all about your overall diet, your overall balance, and all foods can play a role in that. And, you know, getting back to that place of enjoying food. So for some people, we'd be doing like mindful eating exercises with food to really tap into, you know, what's it taste like and what foods do you really like. Can be a lot of experimenting. If someone wants to go down the intuitive eating approach route, that can be a really good one. And not for somebody who's, you know, suffering from a severe eating disorder, but for somebody who is on the less extreme end, who wants to maybe improve their relationship with food. It can be really nice because, you know, there are parts of it where you focus on positive body image and that intuitive movement that we mentioned. Nutrition does come into it, but it's the last step. It's gentle nutrition, where you are considering, you know, what feels good, what tastes good, but also, you know, how do I want to feel and what would actually, you know, make me feel good and make sure my bowels are regular and all these other things that food has an impact on. So it's just much bigger picture, but it's really focusing on those internal signals of hunger, of fullness, of eating mindfully, of enjoying food, and not being scared of that kind of satisfaction factor, because that's something that a lot of us have, that we're almost scared to feel full or to enjoy our food. You know, that it's almost like society sort of says that you always have to be on a diet or you always have to be a little bit hungry. And it's, it's just throwing away those unhelpful rules and ditching all of that diet culture, and just getting to kind of a freer and happier place with food. But it's quite hard to explain it so briefly because it's such a long process, and it's something that it's a self-discovery journey, and it's very individual, but it's a really worthwhile thing to do.
Yeah, definitely. I suppose there's no quick fix in the same way that there is no quick fix in terms of all the ridiculous fad diets that we see eluded everywhere.
Yeah, true.
And then just to finish us off, I wonder whether you could share us another 3 top tips, but for people who perhaps want to speak to someone who they think may be suffering from maybe a more severe version of an eating disorder, or supporting someone who has been diagnosed.
Yeah, really good question. So I think it really does come back to what we were saying. We were kind of talking about it in terms of like a household, but it may not be a household. It may be a friend, but not using that unhelpful language around weight, shape, food, diets, those kinds of things to start with. Providing lots of reassurance. So, just being there for that person is really the most important thing. And I guess if it's in a more kind of a family context as well, just making sure that, just taking blame out of the equation. So, you're not blaming yourself, you're not blaming the person, and, they aren't blaming anyone, because as we said earlier, it's so complex, all the reasons that can lead to an eating disorder developing. It's not one person's fault at all. And yeah, in terms of kind of practical advice, I would really encourage people to check out the leaflet from Beat on the Beat website. And I forget what it's called exactly, but I think it's like supporting a loved one with an eating disorder, or how do I speak about an eating disorder, or something like that. And it just goes through a lot more. It even gives like little ideas of, how to phrase things. It's really helpful.
That's really helpful, because I think people are probably sometimes worried about saying anything in fear of saying the wrong thing, and then that can obviously also cause issues. So having some phrases that you can utilize is really, really helpful in supporting that
Yeah,
person.
and I mean that is something. I mean, for health professionals as well, I feel in this area sometimes we can be scared to sort of say the wrong thing, but it's just much more important to just be there for that person, to to be honest, to be supportive, and to kind of to respect their strength that they have as well, because um, they're not going to be this really delicate person. We're not going to break them by saying anything. It's just I know I did say be careful of what we're saying, but it's much more important to just actually be there and to be able to have the conversation. And people understand that we're all human, we're not perfect, but we just do our best and just be there for the person, really.
Definitely. And life would be boring if we were perfect, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, no such thing as perfect.
No, definitely not. So I really hope that today's episode has helped to debunk some of the myths around food, to help raise some awareness about disordered eating, and to really help to support people on a journey to hopefully having a more positive attitude towards their bodies and towards the food that they're consuming. And I'm so grateful, Maeve, that you came on to share your knowledge and your top tips. And I'd really recommend heading over to the Beat website and also to Maeve's Instagram page, which will be linked in the bio, for all of her debunking and amazing nutrition information.
Thank you so much for having me on. It was lovely speaking to you.
Yeah, it's been brilliant, and I hope to catch up with you very soon.